Japanese colleagues. And I'm looking forward to coming also and teaching in the program. It's very exciting for me. I'm really a believer, I think you'll see from my presentation, I'm a believer in seeing things globally. So it's really also exciting to have a chance to come here and to exchange ideas. Okay, now I'm going to start with a quote. In Europe, traditional political and economic forms come crashing down. New ideas and ideals arise and collide against one another with a great noise, and are in turn mercilessly ground to dust. There is an intense and bitter struggle over principles, a restless search for new life values. There is a hellish racket, mistrust and envy between peoples, classes, and groups. A desperate and chaotic situation reigns in nearly all areas of life. In this chaotic, shaken-up, forward-driving world, amid nations and classes laying siege to one another, in this time of declining and rising worldviews, of the triumph of science and technology, the Indonesian folk, the people, must find its way towards political freedom and national happiness. Will we, ignoring the lessons of European history and closing our eyes to the political, economic, and social failures of the West, steer our cultural course towards the Occidental model? Must we forever be satisfied with what has been left behind by others and found worthless, trudging behind in the wake of other nations? So wrote Sanusi Pane, a rising young light of indigenous intellectual life in the Netherlands East Indies, and an outspoken voice of Indonesia's fledgling, struggling nationalist movement in November of 1931, more than a decade before Japan's victorious imperial armies swept into Southeast Asia under the stirring banner of Asia for the Asians. Batavia, or as the nationalists like Pane called it, Jakarta, 1931. In both time and space, a place far removed from where discussion of the Second World War or Japan's place within it would conventionally begin. Yet for students of the era, both the world and the worldview that Sanusi Pane presents here will, I think, be nevertheless remarkably familiar. On the one hand, Pane was clearly speaking from a particular social and geographical vantage point, that of an Asian anti-colonial nationalist struggling against Western domination. Yet on the other, his statement offers a remarkably sophisticated global perspective on the dynamics, challenges, fears, and dreams of the era. One that challenges the conventional frame of vision in which the Second World War, and indeed the place of Japan within that war, are conventionally located. To me, therefore, it seems like a perfect place to start. Above all, for students of interwar Japan, Pane's social perspective and critique will no doubt have a particular resonance. It's easy to draw parallels between these kinds of statements and those of, for example, the philosophers and scholars famously associated with the later Showa Kenkyukai, or the Wartime Symposium on Overcoming Modernity in 1942. And also, to some extent, that of General Ishiwara Kanji, who masterminded Japan's aggressive move to occupy Manchuria in that very same autumn of 1931. As the scholarship of Louise Young and many others has since shown, not only for Ishiwara and his many followers in the Kwantung Army, but for state officials, intellectuals, and indeed a broad cross-section of Japanese society as a whole, the colonization of Manchuria was a bid to secure resources, living space, and militarily strategic territory in dangerous global times. But the visions associated with it also quickly assumed revolutionary proportions. Japan was to build in Manchukuo a veritable social paradise in which domestic tensions of class versus class, regional tensions of ethnicity and rising anti-colonial resistance, global tensions of great power rivalry and protectionism, and modern afflictions of materialism, individualism, and associated moral decay and corruption imported from the West would be transcended through a combined return to the lost Asian values of the past, and a leap into a state-of-the-art, socially engineered future. Manchukuo promised not only a living space, but a dream landscape, in which the very contradictions of Japan's modernity and its multiple crises, economic, social, political, cultural, and imperial, would be resolved at a stroke. I think I can see a direct connection here with Idris's presentation just now. What's the... it fits exactly with that image. As scholars such as Harry Harutunian have shown, while inflected locally, such dreams and discourses were symptomatic of an interwar ideological condition prompted by a multi-layered crisis of liberal industrial capitalist modernity, whose global nature, effects, and dynamics have been conventionally out of focus. The global nature of this has been out of focus. Simultaneously and interactively, in Europe and Japan, the perception of the moment as demanding and potentially promising a radical means of overcoming modernity was an expression of, in Haratunian's words, being overcome by modernity. The social dislocations and stark imbalances of what Haratunian calls the characteristic unevenness of industrial capitalist economic development and their quickening pace, the emergence of the increasingly assertive masses into political and social life, the rise of radical challenges to the social status quo from the left and the right, the declining authority of the established institutions and mores, and an associated sense of moral decline, and the virtual collapse of the global liberal capitalist economy, triggered by the Wall Street crash of 1929. It's a big laundry that once you get started with all of the crises that people were experiencing in the early 1930s, you get a very long list very fast. All were components of the deepest global crisis witnessed in modern times. Particularly vividly reflected in the Indonesian perspective of Sanusi Pane and in contemporaneous Japanese fantasies of Manchukuo alike is the shared concurrent perception of a crisis in the Western-dominated global imperial order. Both reflected a sense of living in a time of unprecedented vulnerability in that order, offering a correspondingly historic possibility of overcoming it. Yet despite the similarities between Japanese imperialist and Indonesian nationalist rhetoric at this time, it's essential to note that they arose quite independently from one another. This is indeed a reflection of the fundamentally global nature of the crisis that generated them both. Sanusi Pane and others, such as Sukarno and Hatta, identified much less with Asia's sole imperial power, Japan, whose aggression in Manchuria they actually condemned, than with fellow anti-colonial nationalists in places like India and the Middle East. Now, as Chinese resistance stiffened and Japanese forces became bogged down in a brutal war of colonial suppression in China from 1937, Japan's rhetoric of pursuing a world historical mission of Asian rescue from the clutches of Western modernity, capitalism, and imperialism grew ever more elaborate and shrill, and Japan's population grew more resolutely committed to it. And this is something that's very clearly demonstrated in Professor Yoshimi Yoshiaki's book, Grassroots Fascism, which I recently translated. Japan's propaganda campaign failed to win the hearts and minds of most Chinese, however, and it was not yet aimed at Southeast or South Asians. For the time being, Southeast Asians ranged from apathetic to critical of Japan's war in Northeast Asia. Whatever the fundamental conflict between Japanese imperial and Asian anti-colonial agendas, however, between them stood a common enemy under increasingly global siege, the imperial West, and thus, at least, the latent potential for a revolutionary joining of forces. In 1942, when Japan backed up its powerful rhetorical critique of modern Western civilization and claims to liberate Asia with astounding military success, Sanusi Pane was among many Indonesian nationalists who became, for a time at least, convinced of the world historical necessity of such a collaboration between Indonesians and Japanese, whatever its risks. Now, although the global crisis of empire that preceded and precipitated the Second World War is rarely foregrounded in conventional narratives of that war, its depth and seriousness was felt broadly across Europe as well as outside of it. By the end of the decade, commentators from across the political spectrum, not only in Berlin, Tokyo, and Moscow, but also in London, Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam, were singing a similar refrain about the passing of the old global order and sharing a similar conviction in the inevitability of a radically new one, for better or for worse. This is demonstrated in the title of a book that came out in 1938 by the liberal German economist M.J. Bonn, which was called The Crumbling of Empire, the Disintegration of the World Economy. Now, in a glowing review of Bonn's book for the Dutch magazine De Economist that appeared late the next year, so several months after the German invasion of Poland, the conservative young economist and future secretary of the upper chamber of the Dutch parliament for the dominant Catholic Volkspartij, Dr. T.H.L. Thurlings, remarked, in a compelling manner, Bonn, a German professor in exile now working in London, highlights the dislocation of our present-day society and shows how the great powers are slowly but surely disintegrating, partly through their own fault, partly through a kind of destiny that seems to seek to drive mankind to ruin. Now, the Dutch observers such as Thurlings were particularly fearful of such an imminent imperial disintegration, was at least in part a measure of the extent to which the Netherlands Indies was perceived as particularly vulnerable to the joint threat posed by anti-colonial nationalism and Japanese military and imperial ambitions. So this is an image that the Dutch published in 1941, the Dutch colonial government, to try to encourage, to get international sympathy for this Japanese threat to their Netherlands Indies. Now, the Indonesian nationalists, of course, saw this a little bit differently, as did the Japanese. It's a highly racist image, which is, should make us quite uncomfortable. And I think it shows the degree of, it also shows the degree of fear in Dutch minds at the time of this possibility. And so the Indies were the jewel in the Dutch colonial crown, is integral a part of the modern Dutch economy and identity, as Korea and Manchukuo had become for Japan. The Dutch fascist National Socialistische Beweging, the NSB, founded in 1931, were also acutely aware of both threats, so the Indonesian nationalists and the Japanese. In the midst of a Great Depression that hit both metropole and colony hard, the NSB party scored great political successes not only by attacking communists and other enemies of the Dutch nation and Western civilization, but by profiling itself as the nation's most determined defender of the Dutch Empire. Now, as I keep talking here, because my time is limited, I'm going to show you a little clip of the Dutch fascist party leaders their decision to collaborate with the Japanese. Until Nazi Germany occupied the Netherlands in 1940, meanwhile, donations from the Dutch colonial community would remain the single most important source of revenue for the NSB, a colonial lifeline for Holland's metropolitan fascists. In post-war Dutch school books and historiography, however, it is only the subsequent domestic role of the NSB as a loyal collaborator with the Nazis that receives regular attention. Now, whether as viewed as an imminent opportunity, as both the Japanese and European fascists saw it, or as an imminent disaster, as perceived by status quo spokesmen like Teurlings, the sense of a Western-dominated world in disintegration through a two-pronged crisis of liberal capitalism and empire was central to the global experience of the Second World War, to the form that it took and to the course that it would follow. It is as much a part of European history as of Asian history, and indeed the two must be seen in interaction in order for the war to be properly understood. Yet this is not how the history of the Second World War has usually been understood or written since. As I note in my introduction to my recent translation of Professor Yoshimi's Grassroots Fascism, in recent years and with increasing effectiveness, scholarship informed by a post-colonial problematic has sought to reveal the hidden yet essential interrelationship and interdependence of the history of modern Europe with that of its colonies. Yet the history of the Second World War remains among the strongest of Eurocentric bastions, its imperial aspects relegated to the periphery of conventional narrative and knowledge. The project of revealing the central role of empire in the Second World War and in fascism necessitates an overcoming of the Eurocentric assumptions built into the study of the war and of fascism itself. The conventional narratives and conceptualizations of the Second World War have situated Asia's war experience as peripheral to the main conflict, centered upon Nazi Germany. Within this framework, students of Japan's war have long felt compelled to orient their conceptual debates around the question of whether Japan's experience qualifies for comparison with that of Europe. Here I would like to suggest that we can understand a great deal more about the Second World War as a global conflict, precisely by locating our narrative in a transnational frame that includes Europe, but whose center lies outside of it, in this case, in Asia. In my discussion this far, I've tried to highlight such hidden aspects of the global context by emphasizing parallel trajectories and radicalizations of Southeast Asian anti-colonial and Japanese imperial ideologies on the eve of the global conflict, and how both joined the interwar ideological assault from left and right to feed into imperial Western Europe's sense of disintegration. To understand the specific local expression and evolution of wartime ideologies of fascism, imperialism, and anti-colonialism within such a global frame, however, it remains equally important to emphasize the role of specifically local interactions, negotiations, and resistances. And it is here, starting with Japan's confrontation with China in particular, that Japan's wartime experience can be repositioned, I would argue, as central in global history. Now, by any measure, it would be hard to dispute the identity of the Sino-Japanese War as a modern total war that constituted a central part of and played a great part in precipitating the wider war. It involved the mobilization of millions, touched the lives of tens, if not hundreds of millions more, and resulted in the destruction and reconstruction of the economies, political, and social orders of the world's most populous society, China, along with those of the entire Japanese Empire. It set the empires of Japan, the United States, and the Western powers in the Pacific on a collision course with the rest of Asia, the ultimate victim. In the same period, and within the same historical dynamic, the Soviet Union and Japan, too, became entangled in a secret war on the Manchurian frontier, whose outcome had deep implications for the global conflict that subsequently ensued. One big result of that was that the Japanese decided not to attack the Soviet Union and to move south instead. More profoundly, as Prasenjit Dwara has argued, among others, the modern Sino-Japanese conflict represented a destructive, but also dialectically productive site of struggle between imperialism and anti-colonial nationalism, signaling the transition from a world order dominated by the former to one dominated by the latter. So a move from a world dominated by empires to a world dominated by nation states. In this evolving struggle with nationalism and communism over local hearts and minds that foreshadowed developments throughout the Third World in the Cold War decades to come, Japanese imperialism was compelled to attempt to ideologically adjust to the demands of a post-colonial world, reinventing itself as a force for regional and even national liberation and development, and engaging with local nationalisms in other parts of Asia in profoundly complex, contradictory, and significant ways. As such, the Sino-Japanese War and the Japanese occupations of Southeast Asia that followed upon it witnessed and heralded broader, essential global historical developments, not only of the Second World War period, but also that of mid-20th century history and beyond, which remained largely invisible from a Eurocentric perspective, focused on allies versus Axis. More radically, I might argue that these developments highlighted and anticipated the longue durée of 20th century history in ways that the story of the Nazi regime and its history does not. The conclusion may thus be that we learn more about 20th century global history and the place of the Second World War within it by centering our narrative of the war on this conflict in Asia than by focusing on the conflict within Europe's borders. In the most basic sense, such an exercise highlights the essential identity of the war's combatants, Allied and Axis alike, as empires, attempting to survive in an increasingly empire-hostile world, undergoing historical evolution and reinvention in response. That the war was about the survival of empires, as well as a defense of European identity, is a rhetoric we associate with the fascist Axis powers, but in fact it applies equally to the combatants on both sides. What fundamentally distinguished the rhetoric of the Allies from that of the Axis on this score was that while Germany and Italy openly sought to defend a European identity defined particularistically, Allied rhetoric increasingly defined the struggle as one to protect Western values defined universally, i.e. democracy, fraternity, equality, against a discriminatory fascist other, while at the same time staying silent about the question of empire. Surprise, surprise. The Japanese ideological position here lay ambiguously between the two, I would argue, emphasizing national along with Asian particularity, Western style technological and scientific modernity, and what might be called a non-Western colored universalism. Even more ambiguous was the position of the Western European societies occupied by the Axis powers, like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Here, resistance to Axis rule and an Anglo-American style appeal to universal Western values did eventually triumph in response to short-sighted, discriminatory, brutal, and exploitative Axis policies. But certainly through the war's early stages, there remained substantial identification with the Axis claim to defend empire and European racial and cultural particularism. Now, viewed in these sorts of global terms, I might argue that the fundamental question for the combatants of both sides of the Second World War was not one of imperialism versus anti-imperialism, nor even one so much of democracy versus fascism, which certainly if you look at it from an Indonesian perspective. Now, who were the Democrats and who were the fascists? It gets pretty confusing. As much as it was the issue of what sort of global imperial order might triumph in a post-war world. Essential to understanding how this played out is to replace, or at the very least supplement, a static, Eurocentric paradigm of the war as a struggle between democratic or communist nation states versus fascist authoritarianisms, to replace that with a historicized, interactive, and relational model of the war as a dynamic competition of global imperialisms. At the heart of this competition were issues of social inclusion and exclusion. Takashi Fujitani's recent work comparing wartime experiences of Koreans under Japanese rule with those of Japanese Americans in the US presents a brilliant and compelling illustration. In Fujitani's narrative, we witness how the interactive exigencies of total war, inter-imperial competition, and empire-wide social mobilization brought about fundamental changes in the status of both groups, and correspondingly in the social mythology of both the Japanese and the American empires and nation-states, with profoundly important consequences for the post-war world. In a social paradigm reflective of what might deem old model imperialism, both groups, that is the Japanese Americans in the United States and Koreans in the Japanese Empire, were systematically excluded as social pariahs throughout the pre-war period, a status reflected on the American side by the mass roundup of Japanese Americans into concentration camps at the war's outset. Yet as the war became globalized, the propaganda war over Asian hearts and minds intensified, and the corresponding need to secure the energies and loyalties of these formerly non-Japanese and non-Americans became more pronounced. At a rhetorical level, at least, these groups were now embraced as Japanese, in the case of Korean military recruits, and as Americans, in the case of Japanese Americans, for the first time. Second-class citizenship and racism were hardly a thing of the past and would be retained in new forms. But the national imperial mythologies of social inclusion and exclusion had been indelibly redefined. For the United States, the Second World War can thus be seen as representing a watershed moment that witnessed the appearance of a universalist, race-blind mythology of national belonging. The light shed by Fujitani's brilliant cross-border perspective on the US-Japan case contains great promise for a global analysis of the Second World War experience more generally. Application of paradigms of social inclusion and exclusion as defined according to a composite of characteristics such as race, class, ethnicity, gender, etc., can provide a standard of historiographical measurement and analysis that crosses conventional boundaries between allies and axis, between empire and nation, and between Europe and the wider world. On a scale defined according to racial inclusion and exclusion, for example, we might productively consider the Nazi German wartime empire in Poland and in the Soviet Union, along with the Japanese Empire in wartime China, and the Italian Empire in Ethiopia, as representing the extreme end of social exclusion, modern imperialism at its most profoundly racist. By the same scale of measurement, the same Japanese, but in occupied Indonesia, the same Nazi Germans, but in occupied Holland, and the Italians in occupied France presented a very different face. Here, they emphasized racial commonality and fraternity against a hypocritical and discriminatory Anglo-American imperialism. And their interaction with local populations also revealed a profoundly different and more productive dynamic. John Dower's work has meanwhile illustrated the profoundly racist face of the American war mentality against the Japanese in the Pacific, as distinctive from that in Europe. A fuller understanding of the logic of these different faces would seem to start with a conceptualization of these competing powers, first and foremost, as competing global empires. Now, relatedly, an understanding of fascism as a historical phenomenon might best be furthered through an analysis that situates it within such a global historical framework. A focus on the imperial identity and ideology of the combatants alone may not entirely account for the extremes of racism and murderousness exhibited by the Nazi regime, or, I might add, the extremes of Japanese behavior in the Sino-Japanese War. Of course, we cannot overlook the role of specific national histories, social struggles, and systems of inclusion and exclusion in the making of what we call fascism. Yet it seems difficult to draw a categorical line between the social exclusions of modern imperialism, more generally, and the specific intensity and nature of the social exclusions characteristic to what we know as fascism. Italian behavior in Ethiopia, Japanese behavior on the killing fields in China, Nazi behavior on the Eastern Front. In this sense, it seems more useful to view and analyze these distinct cases fundamentally as variants of imperialism in a particular late imperial global setting, rather than, as the fascists themselves saw it, as products of specific national histories and identities. Fascism, in other words, may be best understood as a variant of late imperialism. This is a comic from Punch magazine that appeared in 1936. The joke, you probably can't read it, is of the poor Ethiopians who are being gassed by the Italians. And underneath the comment here is, the dawn of progress, but how am I to see it? They blinded me. Globally, the interwar period of late imperialism was distinguished by several fundamental characteristics. It witnessed the struggle and rise of national middle classes to social dominance against older, established high imperial orders, accompanied by mass national social participation and mobilization. It was also characterized by combined national and imperial crises in the form of the threats of anti-colonial nationalism, communism, and a profound crisis in the global liberal capitalist economy. Within this general frame, each specific global location can be seen as presenting a particular mix and balance of social energies, ambitions, mutual histories, and threats, negotiated and evolving over time. Anti-colonial nationalists strove to attain legitimacy as representatives of a post-colonial global system of equal nation-states. Representatives of the Soviet Union and communism sought a new global order that would be not only post-imperial, but also post-national. Both represented a profound threat to Euro-American hegemony and Euro-American global centrality, already called into question by the global economic crisis. Now, against this increasingly powerful array of threats, imperial powers were faced with the dilemma of either accommodating themselves to a modified survival within a post-colonial order, as in the case of the Anglo-Americans, who did a pretty good job of that, I would argue, or seeking to guarantee their survival through the violent maintenance of the established order, a global hierarchy of legitimate and superior nationalisms and races versus illegitimate and inferior ones. If that sounds like fascism, that's what I'm talking about. Within this context, the form of imperialism that we know as fascism might be distinguished by the heightened degree to which the enemy was perceived and experienced not as a legitimate national competitor, according to the ground rules of the established imperial order, but as a radical, illegitimate threat to the survival of the nation-state as empire, and to the imperial order itself. This helps to explain, for example, the difference in the faces shown by the Nazi Germans and Japanese towards their mortal, illegitimate enemies, Soviet communism and Chinese nationalism, as opposed to those shown towards legitimate fellow imperial competitors, such as the Anglo-Americans. The Japanese case is particularly revealing here in its ambiguous positioning between the standpoint of anti-colonial nationalism and that of conventional Eurocentric imperialism. If brutal to the Chinese, and also relatively harsh and fascistic towards its mortal European enemies, they certainly remember the Japanese that way. The Japanese were also relatively more inclusive with regard to regional nationalisms and races perceived for a variety of reasons as related and legitimate, such as those of Southeast Asia. Now, viewed through this lens, the location of Nazi Germany distinctly at the extreme, radical end of the fascist scale is clear enough. But what's more remarkable is the ambiguous positioning of the other imperial players, running right across the conventional Allied Axis divide. Italy, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, and perhaps most intriguingly of all, Japan. Now, time and space don't allow further exploration of the specifics of each case here, but in terms of concreteness, perhaps it's most suggestive to point out that it was precisely this very sense of ambiguity regarding the identity of the war's combatants that confronted Indonesians, Indians, indeed perhaps the majority of the world's population, in trying to make sense of the Second World War from the outside in. Thank you. The last one is a Japanese, I think, really illustrating some of these points. It's a Japanese propaganda poster aimed at South Asians. And you can see the kinds of arguments they're making and the way that they're trying to play empire and Western empire to their advantage. Thank you.